Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for our third and final installment of our lunchtime talks on Roy Lichtenstein. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Olivia Mangini. I'm the programs assistant here at the parish, so if you've attended a program here in the last few months, you've probably gotten an email or two from me. Before we get started, I would like to mention two things. The first being our upcoming welcome days here at the museum on October 11th, 17th, and 23rd that feature free admission for all visitors, guided tours of Tamashi Jackson's The Land Claim, and creative studio family activities. And additionally, on the 23rd, we will have a talk with Donna DeSalvo, who is the Senior Adjunct Curator at the Dia Art Foundation, and Dorothy Lichtenstein on Roy Lichtenstein. That's before and after the dots. So that will also be on the 23rd at 3 p.m. And so now, without further ado, please allow me to welcome the Lewis B. and Dorothy Cullman Chief Curator, Alicia Longwell.
Thank you, Olivia. That was a very nice introduction. That was Olivia's first. She's new to us here. Not too long at the museum, but we're delighted to have her. Ooh, I'll just pull this off. Yes, you know, I was going to have a slide at the end to mention that talk with Dorothy Lichtenstein, who is, of course, Roy's second wife and moved with her husband here in 1970, and long time, really, she thinks of Southampton as her home, although now they did have a place in Florida in Captiva, which they've loved too, and she spends a great deal of time there. Their neighbor was Robert Rauschenberg, good friend, another pop artist name. But this will be really, really special. There's an overworked term, but to hear Dorothy and Roy met. She was the gallery manager at the Bianchini Gallery, which was one of the first in New York to show the pop work. And so she was really there at the birth, you might say. And that's how she and Roy met. And later he had separated from his first wife, and they later divorced, and then he married Dorothy. So that'll be great. And Donna DeSalvo, whom I always think there's nobody here from the 90s, right, who knew Donna. Oh, Wendy. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Wendy. Donna DeSalvo, our incredible curator who was here in the 90s as the Robert Lehman Curator. She was well known even at that point for having done a show called Success is a Job in New York. That was the very first show done about Andy Warhol's early work. So she is very, very knowledgeable about these pop artists and their early work, including Lichtenstein. So it'll be a thrill to have her here. She went on from here to the Wexner, to Tate Modern, to the Whitney for many years, where she distinguished herself. And now, of course, with Dia, which is reinventing itself constantly these days. So very, very happy. That's sort of a reunion of sorts. I think there'll be a lot of people here who have been long time associated with Roy, so that will be a treat. So it's Saturday the 23rd at 3 o'clock, I believe. I'm correct, 3, right? Okay, great. Here in the, I don't know about the live streaming, haven't heard, but I would think if it's not live streamed, it will certainly be recorded. And available, as all things are on the internet. It's pretty amazing. Just we'll ground ourselves for those of you who have not heard. You don't need to have heard the preceding talks by any means, but the good news is this week we're going to get to the dot. A murmur through the crowd. Yes, we've been no dots up to now, but what's been exciting about this journey, and I'll call it that, with Lichtenstein, is to really know what an artist who goes on to become internationally famous. How you start out being an artist. Somewhere in what I was reading for today, I came across a wonderful interview, which I'll quote extensively throughout, because there's nothing better than the artist's words, where he said, you know, I really was lucky. Well, okay, if you want to think of it that way. But a lot of hard work goes into having luck, as one famous artist said. You know, genius is one part. Oh yeah, let me get this right. One part inspiration and the other 9 parts perspiration. So that pretty much sums it up. So right now we're still in those perspiration years. As you know, we spoke last time about being in Columbus, going back to Ohio State, where he did his undergraduate and graduate work, living in the Midwest. A young man born and raised on the Upper West Side, sophisticated, you know, in that sense, which comes from growing up in New York, but very attached to that institution and the pedagogy there. He went back, studied, and then taught there as well, taught undergraduates. So he was kind of settled in Columbus, and then as these things happen, welcome to academe. And for 51, 52, his contract was not renewed, as we discovered, for whatever reason. As I say, welcome to academe. You never know, do you, Helen, what goes on? And then he went on to Cleveland, which is a nearby bigger city, a little more sophisticated. His wife, as we know, Isabel, was working as an interior decorator. I read with interest just this week that he often made mosaic tabletops for clients. He did things like that. And funny to think of Lee Krasner, you may know, she also did a lot of mosaic or things like that. They certainly came up in the WPA working in mosaics, but before she had a studio of her own, she did some things like that. Anyway, he worked as an industrial draftsman, a furniture designer, a window dresser. This is all in Cleveland. And at one point, he was rendering mechanical dials for an electrical instrument company. And we might say that in response to those, I can advance these myself, right? Oh, look how clever. Thank you. I'll take this on. Probably in response to doing that mechanical drawing, he began to paint a series, and they're in the first, we're into gallery it's number 1. It's sort of chronologically the last gallery, but as you go down, if you haven't seen the show yet, it's the first gallery on the left, the large gallery. So he does this pretty incredible series of these renderings of sort of mechanical elements, not entirely sure what that machine is on the right, but he was always interested in things like toys and mechanical toys as well. And on the left is a very beautiful Danish, it's actually a child's toy, a little, well, what would that be? Maybe it too is non-functioning, so the kids don't puncture themselves. But just that idea of that design, and he collected these Danish toys as well. They had 2 sons. David was born in 1954 and Mitchell 2 years later. And this is in that same period when he was working in these mechanical designs and doing these very interesting paintings, which you should see, of course, if you haven't. This beautiful sort of collage of elements, looking sort of sled-like, but really you see in this period Picasso never far away from anyone who went to school of Paris. That was what everyone was taught at that point, and it's sort of very reminiscent of sort of the one at MoMA now, of the Picasso's guitar. which was, this is a metal assemblage. Well, this is 1956, and I will say that throughout this period, being in Cleveland, we know that he, by his own admission, used to just throw paintings in a car and thought really nothing, kind of driving to New York. He had shows throughout the 50s, first at Carlbach Gallery in New York, and then from 52 to 57, he showed with one dealer, John Heller, who did very well selling his paintings. He wasn't quite making a name for himself, but he was, you know, probably had in his mind to leave the Midwest, get back to New York. They were sort of settled. They actually bought a house in Cleveland by 57, but always thinking he would be back in New York. This is 1956. You might call it a proto-pop work. This is a $10 bill. He once commented that it looks like a cubist dollar. It looks like George Washington. It looks like it went. Paul Klee might have done it. It's expressionistic in a way. It's not really pop art yet, but he is looking at objects and thinking, well, you can make a painting out of that object. And this is in 56. And as I said, they had bought a house in Cleveland with intention to stay. Again, Picasso, I had shown this before, but Picasso never far from any young artist's really thoughts at that point in what he might have rendered. This is from just a postcard. Could have been sold in the Midwest or the Far West, and then looking at the head of the mother and also the decorative elements on the little carrying the papoose case. Also never far from any young artist's mind was Jackson Pollock. In 1949, this article, page spread, very prominent. Is he the greatest living painter in the United States? Well, I'm sure a lot of people reading this Life magazine thought, whoa, that's not painting. But there was enough talk about Jackson Pollock at that point to really, if not the most famous, perhaps the most talked about painter in America. So another artist not far from the thoughts of any young artist, as Lichtenstein still was at that point. So we have him moving to Cleveland Heights. Not Cleveland Heights, buying a house there in Cleveland. And oddly enough, after sort of settling down, putting down those roots, in that summer of 58, he got the offer of a position at SUNY Oswego, which is upstate, not New York, not New York City, but New York State, and getting closer, you might say, circling in on Manhattan. Interestingly enough, he was hired to teach industrial design, which he might have, shown some of his mechanical drawings. As he had put feelers out sort of all along, and was unexpectedly heard back from Oswego. He immediately accepted. They pulled up roots and rented maybe an old farmhouse there, which you'll see a picture in a moment. And he made, if not this drawing, one very much like it. And for one of the little boy's bedroom walls, he took an opaque projector. Who remembers those? You're dating yourself, but yes, in the back of the room, whirring very loudly, but you could put any image on top of this plate and have it projected. Well, it worked. It was easy. You could take it right out of books. You didn't just put the book on. At any rate, he drew this. He drew a Mickey, and he projected it on the wall and painted it for his young son. And he commented about in a later interview that he gave in the 90s. It said, it occurred to me by mimicking the cartoon style without the paint texture, calligraphic line, or modulation, all the things involved in expressionism. So he was really trying to do what you might call a cartoon, or was a cartoon character, but sort of stripping away the expressionism that was kind of built in the bone of what he was drawing and looking at. Same with Bugs here. Bugs, who always is, well, he's probably just run a race and beaten someone. He's just going to relax and have a carrot. Very typical Bugs pose here that he's taken. But again, sort of trying to distill and erase really all these expressionistic or gestural elements and really just give you that cartoon character. So he's not quite there yet. I'm getting ahead of myself. So I'll just say in Oswego, he met Reginald Neal. He was who happened to be the head of the art department at Douglas College, which at that point, Rutgers was, which is the state university in New Jersey. There was a Rutgers Men's College and Douglas, which was at that point a women's college. So Neal was the head of the art department at the women's college. That was in Brunswick, and was expanding the studio program, adding faculty members, and he got to know Lichtenstein there upstate in Oswego that summer, and he was hired to teach at Rutgers in 1960, at Douglas rather. He once looked back and said, if he'd stayed in Oswego, probably nothing else would ever have happened to him. Who knows? But, to sort of, and that's when he said, it's amazing how much luck plays into this. And again, we wonder, but I guess it was a stroke of good fortune to meet Reginald Neal that summer. At any rate, it propelled him to Douglas and Rutgers, which was very, very close to New York. A train ride away, right? He has said about this, and also in Oswego, he began, there's Rutgers, or Douglas, which looked pretty much like a 19th century women's college, right? Must have been, looks like the one I went to in Virginia, right? I love this picture, which I discovered somewhere. He looks like a kid still, right? There's still this very, that wry expression. There's just that hint of that smile like, oh boy, I'm teaching college. Very near New York now, but this was like a lookbook published that first year he was in at Douglas, so he could be ID'd by the students, as it were. But this still quite young and very fresh. I think he knew he was, I would say, on the brink of something. That's something. He talked about being in Ohio, being up in Oswego, still sort of in the periphery. He had seen this. This is the 1958 cover. We mentioned Jasper Johns last week. Johns and Rauschenberg, of course, just a little bit older than that first generation of pop artists, but already making their mark by the late 50s. This is his target with Four Faces, made the cover of Art News. Pretty impressive for an artist who was really just starting out. As we remember from the image of the flag last week, when someone asked him, well, why did you paint the American flag? Is it patriotic? What's the point behind that? And he said, and this is quite a Johnsian, which is an adjective that's used throughout late 20th century art criticism. He gave the very Johnsian retort, well, I dreamed I painted a flag, and I woke up and decided to paint one. That's all pretty. He, as you might suspect, pretty opaque, a man of few words. But again, with the targets and don't think the disembodied faces you see up across the top haven't been endlessly analyzed, and well, they should be. But he has always said it was just this idea. He also famously said, "Do something," which in this case might have been paint a target, and then do something else to it, like put 4 plaster heads at the top. That's the way he thought. I haven't read that per se, but that was kind of his mantra: do something else. So Lichtenstein certainly knew about Johns, certainly knew about Rauschenberg. I did not know them personally or really have any interaction with them by the time he got to Douglas. Much more likely there to have run across, when asked, what sort of early pop art were you noticing? And still, this is all sort of that term proto-pop. This is very early. Who's this? Oldenburg. That's a kind of a later photograph, but I couldn't resist. He's actually carrying one of his soft toothpaste tubes there and getting quite a look from a woman on the street. Much of what Oldenburg did early, this is not soft on the left. You're probably all more familiar with the soft, the giant hamburger, the giant whatever, but the soft sculpture. But this on the left is what Lichtenstein remembered from very early on was bacon and egg. This is a plaster. Oldenburg had something called store days. He was very influenced by signage. This could almost be the perfect sign for a diner to hang out the bacon and egg display. Of course, it's a little too drippy. It's very painterly in that sense. This would have been painted plaster. But this is what Lichtenstein first knew also in this period, and we're into 60, 61, very early. This is Frank Stella. He actually recalls seeing the Frank Stella, one of these very early, concentric square, basically, paintings. And he always remembered that, which really made him realize that in truth, Stella wasn't painting anything. He wasn't painting concentric squares. He was making a painting. He was making an object. This is really about the art becoming the object, not to go into there are massive dissertations and books written about this, but the fact of the matter that this painting is really mostly or entirely about itself. It's not, you can't read into Frank Stella's mind at that moment per se. It's really about making a painting. So all these ideas were becoming much more, what can I say, tangible for Lichtenstein. Just the proximity of being at Rutgers, Douglas, teaching and living in New Jersey. This is Alan Kaprow, who was teaching there as well, one of the artists that really befriended Lichtenstein. And this is 61 on the left, an exhibition at the Martha Jackson Gallery called Tyre, interestingly enough. He was, Alan Kaprow, you may have heard that name associated with happenings, which we all think back to our hippie days. They just happened. They were spontaneous. I guess Martha Jackson knew he was going to bring X number of tires into the gallery, but maybe she didn't. This was the act, the performance, the tangible result of just an idea of filling up. I'm going to fill the gallery. My show will be piling up tires. Well, and then also the next year at the Smallin Gallery, the show was called Words, which obviously is what it was about. Lichtenstein later commented that what I got from Kaprow is that whatever you're doing doesn't have to look like art. Now, that's a fairly simple statement, but it's kind of almost a breakthrough. Lichtenstein always talked about when you're in school, when you're in graduate school and you're painting, you have the color and the form, and you're just desperate to do something original. True, right? You don't want to do a painting like your next door neighbor there in the studio. But in essence, this is what spurs him on. Doesn't really have to be original in the sense that it was never done anywhere else on the planet through time and space ever. And being in this Kaprow was teaching there at the time, being really in sort of this hotbed of the most contemporary art happening, really spurred him on to be thinking about this. Now, also in the last gallery, on the north wall, you'll see these very interesting paintings. You probably didn't know Roy Lichtenstein made work that looked like this. I mean, I didn't. This is something you really don't see, which is what is so fascinating about this exhibition and so instructive about this idea of artists trying things and experimenting and working hard. Well, he was doing this when he'd already started teaching at Douglas. And he said to the extent that any of his fellow teachers saw it, they hated it. He was living in Highland Park. And he said, this is maybe, he's done the Mickey, he's done the expressionistic Mickey and Bugs, very painterly. And he is doing this and still in that mindset of, God, I've got to be original, right? So he's looking at this and he's thinking don't think this is original, Roy. This looks like de Kooning or something. This is not original work. You would have to. And he says he was not naive enough to become completely discouraged when he had that realization. And then he went on to think, well, if you really, when you're working like this, and let's say it took 15 years to sort of get through this working it all out period before he comes to the recognizable style we know, if you get completely discouraged if you really understood how unique you really have to be to make it happen. So he's saying, in a way, two different things. You don't need to be original, but you need to be yourself in a way. And he said if someone had told him you're going to have a unique style, he would have been really discouraged fairly on. And what he did, he said, he sort of stumbled on what this, and we'll come on to this in just a moment, but he really stumbled on it. And working at this point, he describes as really being in a sort of turmoil. By doing this paint, you can see exact painting, you can see exact, and they're beautiful. I mean, they're wonderful, but he realized they weren't going anywhere, so to speak. What he had done, and you see it quite clearly in this photograph, was I've heard it described as like a tea towel, but sort of wrapped around his hand, and having on a palette a line of blue and green and red, different yellow, and on a palette, and then putting this wrapped hand in there, and then taking it and just, you can see the strokes, which are not brush strokes because he's using his hand, but you can see them very clearly. And these are all from about 1960. Those painterly bugs and Mickey were around 59. And these were around 60, this whole group of these, you might say, Abex paintings, which they really aren't, but, you know, looking more like Abex than anything else he had done heretofore. At any rate, he had these in his studio in Highland Park, and as he said, if any of his fellow professors came over, they just hated them. He sort of, he said the one person who didn't really hate them was Kaprow when he came. And Kaprow had said, you know, okay, that's really going somewhere, I think. But he went over in a corner of the studio, and I've heard this, I might have mentioned it before, I've heard this validated by two very reputable archivists and historians in this period. One, the archivist for the Lichtenstein Foundation, and they both heard the story from Kaprow and from Lichtenstein himself, that Kaprow went over and saw the painting in the center, which was called Look Mickey, in a corner, and pulled it out and said, Roy, this is what you should go with this. This is what you should be doing. This looks like you. In point of fact, he did have the two sons, as we've mentioned. There's a little bit later photograph, of course, with Lichtenstein in the studio and with the boys there on the floor. I think they're both there, right? Yeah, they're both there. With the comic books, you know, spread out over everywhere. And actually, the reason he did Look Mickey there in the center was that one of the boys had come to him and said, Dad, and of course the son was looking at these paintings, right, going, Dad, why don't you paint a picture that I'd like? Probably the same child that wanted the Mickey on his wall. Maybe it was Mitchell. And this is a page directly from a little golden book, those little books that we all had as kids, and said, make a picture like this, you know, one I'd like. And that's when Roy said, okay, I'll do that. And of course, there's Donald and Mickey. And, look, Mickey, I've hooked a big one. Now, this painting probably generally acknowledged as really the first pop painting, and is a national treasure. It's in the National Gallery. Certainly couldn't have traveled here, although it would have been wonderful to have it. There's a small reproduction of it on a wall text in that room. But, you know, this is a departure from everything. This, he took, you know, the little golden book. And I even love, I love the, what do you call those things? Bobbins? What are the, on the fishing line? I forget what that's called. A what? A floater? Okay. Well, whatever. It's, I mean, it's even the way Mickey's you know, fishing line comes down that curve. It's a direct lift. There's no question about it. Now, the interesting thing is that he had done that painting, and they obviously had a dog because he had a dog brush lying around the studio somewhere. And he picked up this dog brush, which I assume would have been a, you know, a metal one with a lot of metal prongs. And he dipped it in some paint and took it, and this isn't a large painting, so he would have to have been careful about not dripping, but he went into the painting, and as you can see, and if you go home and blow it up on the internet, you can see even better. Here we go. He went into the whites of Donald's eyes and did this, basically a stipple with this dog brush in blue paint. This he's talked about And, it was kind of that idea. Someone once said, well, why'd you do that? And he went, nah, in true Johnsian sense, he said, well, I just wanted to, do something else to it. So if you want to call these the proto-dots, I think you're well within your art historical canon. This is a painting from 1960. He went on to sort of pursue this realm, not so much the comics at this point, but also looking at advertising, anything as if we've learned really from our other two moments together, and as you've seen, as you've gone through the show, what he really did was just try everything. It was experimentation. It was a time of looking around. And he just says that at that moment that Alan Kaprow was so important for him, the encouragement, that he was amazed at how much Kaprow really liked it. As I said, most people didn't. And these works were not large, either the Oldenburg. At that point, it hadn't gotten to the sort of bigger scale of what we might think of as pop art. But it just, after this Look Mickey and it was seen, it was really a meteoric rise, you might say, of how he began to paint quite sort of feverishly, in that this showed him a direction to go in. And his next, and this painting, the Girl with Ball, there's a descriptive title, is really from 1961. Now, if you think of what was accomplished between 1960 and 61, it's what you'd call a breakthrough, really, without being afraid of too much overstating. Again, he wasn't looking at a model. He wasn't looking at cartoons in this sense. This has been documented, and he said it. It was an advertisement for a resort in the Poconos, I guess. So he's taking a lot from advertising. Obviously, he's taking a lot from that genre. He's also commercialism. He's also what could be more sort of, at least East Coast American than a vacation in the Poconos. Something is Mount Airy Lodge, which sounds like someone made it up, but I'm sure there was a real Mount Airy Lodge. And this, there's so many things that are still very painterly about this. And in truth, with any Lichtenstein painting, they're not direct. In these later paintings, there's certainly nothing is so direct as not to really see these painterly qualities. So many things similar to Warhol and what he was doing and looking at advertising. Of course, Warhol famously did advertising. He drew all the shoes, the wonderful shoes for I. Miller. That's what he did when he first came to New York. But I think I just want to go back a minute to just to look at this moment, barely a year before, but when just on the sort of cut, this is, abstract expressionism by any other name. You'd have to call it that. And, it's almost too late to be experimenting with that way. But in truth, he hadn't worked his way through it. We see the moments of when he was looking at Picasso, or when he was looking at Paul Klee, or other earlier 20th century artists, and he takes that in, paints, and sort of works through it in that way. What he hadn't come, and it's not unusual for to be the most near to you in chronology. The Abex came in 45. If you want to look at 49, when was Pollock the most famous painter in the whole world? So he's very close to this whole phenomenon. He sees it as a young artist, and in a way he has to sort of kill the father, as it were. He has to work through that. And what's really amazing about Lichtenstein is he had a very, very quick progression through this sort of overthrowing the previous generation. He knew immediately that he wasn't painting anything Lichtenstein. It looked more like a de Kooning in a way. So that's what makes it all the more miraculous now that this is the next turn in his work. Now, if Mitchell hadn't come up with his little book, again, was it luck? I don't know. I don't think so. But these things happen, you know, in art as in life. You have to make your own luck. And I think Lichtenstein was always a person who looked at art before him, looked at art that was being made by contemporaries of his, and really looked on to really something farther in the future. So do remember that we did manage to end with some dots. So I'd be glad to answer any questions or anyone want to talk, share anything about this. I hope you've enjoyed the exhibition. And what is to me so really astonishing about this, aside from the fact that much of it is work that has been rarely seen publicly, and certainly not written about in this depth. The parish has had a long association with Lichtenstein and with Dorothy, who served on our board for many, many years, and still is an active part of the museum. We're in the Lichtenstein Theater, don't forget. But just to know an artist, and he was very fond of Southampton. They spent a lot of time here, winter and summer, for a long period of time. He wrote about, I may have mentioned, he knew his neighbor Fairfield Porter, who lived sort of 2 blocks up South Main Street, which I read that really interesting early review that Lichtenstein wrote about him, a pretty incredible review. This is way before the pop work, really, but Lichtenstein, Fairfield Porter recognized something in this young painter. But so in 1982, and this would have been, of course, in the old building, an exhibition was organized of, it was really a mini retrospective in that sense, as it sort of covered the whole range of his work up to that point. And interestingly enough, Look Mickey was in that show, had been borrowed from the National Gallery. And our daughter was, she was in a stroller. I think she couldn't have been more than 6 months old at that time. And we wheeled by. It was actually before I worked at the parish. There was a time when I didn't work here, but I went right past that, and she goes, "Mickey." Maybe I'm exaggerating. Maybe she was a year old, but I will just say this is an instantly recognizable image, probably for every child in the world, to say, "Oh, look, Mickey." In 82, then we did a survey of his print exhibition, which was organized by the National Gallery. He was a prodigious printmaker throughout his career. Very beautiful, experimental, all sorts of mediums, all sorts of, editioned work. And we had that exhibition. We actually did a small show that the Montclair Museum, which has an extensive collection of Native American material, sort of showing that material in tandem with some of his imagery of Native Americans. So it just seemed absolutely right that we would take this exhibition and show this work. As I said, it's really the first one to focus on this early period, although there have been, myriad exhibitions of his work over the years. The foundation actually has made it their work to sort of bring some of the early pieces, which, I mean, things would turn up at yard sales in Ohio, actually. I mean, you can imagine that kind of thing. Someone had a Lichtenstein that, of course, didn't look like a Lichtenstein by the time they cleaned out the attic, so nobody knew what it was, that kind of thing. And the foundation made a real effort to sort of find material, particularly in Columbus and Cleveland. And so that's why quite a few of the works are credited to the foundation. And they will, of course, place them in institutions eventually. Large gift has been made to the Whitney. His New York studio and where they lived was quite close to the new Whitney site, so there was a real affection there. So just a long history that we think of as very, very personal with this extraordinary artist who lived so near to us in Southampton. And yes, Helen. Well, two colleagues of mine from graduate school, Beth Finch is at Colby College in Maine, and Marshall Price is the curator at the Nasher Museum at Duke. And both of them have early Lichtensteins in their collection. Now, when you sort of come upon these, both are, I guess both maybe been at these institutions 4 or 5 years, enough to come and, learn about the collection. And I think when you stumble on this, if you don't know this particular period, it's kind of a head scratcher. You go, wow, we've got a Lichtenstein, and wow, what are we going to do with it? And an early Lichtenstein. And they got together and were talking about, and went to the foundation, who was ecstatic to find two, scholars who were interested in this work, and with certainly the, support of the foundation in many ways, who wanted to see the exhibition happen. So they had complete access to all the archives and knowing where all sort of known early work was. So a lot of research was open to them. So that's when they set about organizing the exhibition. And when I got wind of it, I said, well, it has to come here. It was certainly going to be at those two institutions, and I was just very eager, and the director here also, to bring it sort of within the purview of New York. Yeah. It's going on to the Columbus Museum of Art in Columbus as because the foundation has donated work, but also endowed things at that school, because Roy was so close to it, going undergraduate and graduate, and was so influenced by Hoyt Sherman, the great teacher there. So there's a big connection with Lichtenstein there. So that's why it's going to Columbus. Yes? Interesting. Well, welcome to academia. I don't know. I never have been involved. Only a student, not an employee. I think, Helen, taste change, things change. No, I don't think it was anything precipitous. I mean, he was very young. Yes, maybe that too. Maybe it just seemed like his day job, but I can't think of that he wouldn't have been a good teacher in many ways. But I think, there's the department chair, and I suppose tastes change and what you want, or maybe someone else. It's pretty easy to sever ties if you don't have tenure. I understand. Yeah. Well, that's spoken like a veteran. Thank you. as I say, academia is a world unto its own. Sometimes you never know why people are, not given tenure. Did everyone hear that? Helen, the reason academic politics is so vicious is because there's so little at stake. Yes, they have to make a big deal out of it. You're right. But I never read of anything specific. It was just at a moment when he sort of finished. I think he was surprised by it, but I don't think it was anything that had been precipitated. Yes.
I was wondering, did you ever hear of any copyright issues with like Oldenburg?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I think no, because it's been generated into a work of art. The only thing I think you sometimes hear, while our Mr. Jeff Koons sometimes people get after him for various things, but now with many more lawyers in the world maybe. But no, it's never been. I mean, things were just, transformed in a way. It was no different from anything. No. No, I don't. That image wouldn't have been copyrighted, actually. And on that, I don't. I think it was a drawing, maybe. Yeah, I don't. I don't. No, I've never really heard. I don't know. Is anyone else with anyone? I don't. Yes.
Has this studio here in Southampton been preserved, and have there ever been tours of it?
Well, I don't know about tours. I have seen it. Interestingly enough, when the architects Herzog and Demeron, who built this building, when they came kind of on a research trip, they wanted to see artist studios. They were very interested in that as a sort of typology for galleries that they would build for us to show art in. They were very interested in, first of all, by the pitch of the barn. So many artist studios here are in 18th and 19th. 18th that they're still standing, but that profile of the barn, which was very, put in a few skylights and you've got this great space. So actually that was inspirational for the artists. We took them to quite a few of those sort of converted barns. And we went to see William Merritt Chase's studio, which was in his home in the Shinnecock Hills. So being postmodernist architects, they made sort of these typologies. There was the barn, there was the domestic space, which was renovated for studio, and then there was the Lichtenstein. It was a garage type building on the house they bought here in 1970 is down on Jen Lane. It was really the carriage house, the sort of small house on the front of the property that could have been, a garage or a lodging for some the driver or something. But they were going to live there, and Lichtenstein thought he could have his studio in the top floor, which was kind of a loft, but he realized it was too small. So they had a sort of purpose-built space that looked rather garage-like, had cement floors. It was a very utilitarian building. So the architects seized on that as the purpose-built, typology, which informed everything. And in answer to your question, yes, I mean, there would be very private sort of things. I know Dorothy has been gracious to open, that. As I say, we went that day with the architects to see Lichtenstein's, and it's still there. He still has staff that works on various things. He did additions of sculptures. You may have seen these. I know one of his longtime assistants still conserves or sort of reconditions some sculptures sometimes when they're brought back in. But it's still It's very active, very in the sense that it's, people are there working. It's preserved in a way. You see a lot of things out on the tables, sort of imagery. He, something like the Mount Airy Lodge advertisement, things like that are still on the tabletops. And books, a lot of books, which of course we learned that he had looked at the George Catlin wonderful watercolors of the Native Americans, all those sort of books he had and studied, and a lot of things are still there. So it is preserved in that sense. It's not generally opened, but as Dorothy has been gracious about, opening it to small, special groups, I would say, not generally open. That's a good question. It's still right there. And she spends, much of her time right here in Southampton in the summers. Anything else? I hope everyone has enjoyed the exhibition and seeing it. I still think it's really the most remarkable coming together of a work that shows an artist's early years in that sort of, you see struggle. He alludes in that interview. He said by the time he reached this Abex thing, that's sort of that's almost like a last gesture, like, good God, let me do this and see if that works. He called it turmoil. I mean, you see that. There's no artist that gets to these heights that doesn't go through that. I think it takes a lot of work, a lot of perspiration, so to speak. Yes, something else?
I love the exhibit because it was rare. You don't see those works.
Right.
It's more exciting to see. I just saw the John show, and Jasper Johns at the Whitney is wonderful. You've seen much of it, whereas this is an excavation. A bit more. But I just wanted to say that the words, that last photograph you showed where there was a large cartoon meaning of two people embracing, the words took this artist into the realm of irony in a way none of the other pop artists, maybe a few early Andy Warhols, had newspaper words on them, and then after that, of course, Basquiat. But these cartoon words had such irony that I think they have a lot to do with the popularity of later work. And we haven't reached there yet in this show.
Yeah, it's like Instagram, of all the lettres. I mean, people are always being told off in these, in those wry statements, and Brad's not coming to pull her out of that water, but she's going to scream nonetheless. Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting point. I mean, words were not used quite in that same way by by the pop artists. Yeah. No, I'm so glad you felt that way and saw that. I mean, I did, as I've said, there's been more than one person screaming, "Where are the dots?" But I think once people really begin to absorb what this means and think about what it means in the long arc of a career, I mean, 15 years is a long time when you're living it. It doesn't seem so long in a chronology when you have many more years to talk about. But this was a slog. This was hard work and some turmoil, in his personal life too as well. So all in there. Well, I don't know. I mean, I do know that by the time after Oswego and really into New Jersey, I know they had separated and were divorcing. I don't know, a ton of details, but that's always turmoil, particularly with small children. So that much I know. So they divorced. I do know that, he and Dorothy were just a, wonderful love match. finding one another and always very, very happy together. So that may be a more halcyon period in his life, but yeah, I don't know, too many details about that, but just to say you can imagine that kind of thing is. And his own, not really making it those years, that's like almost 10 years, and Columbus and Cleveland, where he was window dressing or painting dials. I mean, he wanted to make some money, but he wasn't making any money selling paintings. He was showing in New York, but nothing would have really told him the future. But he stuck with it. I think, artists, I mean, maybe seem overly romantic, but I think real, artists do know they, like us, get up, have their Wheaties, and go into the studio and work and paint. And something is driving that, something very special. So it's not quite makes me eat my Wheaties and come to work, but I don't mean to make light of it. I just think it's a real, you have something inside you, if not to sound too corny, that you want to. And of course, many people don't make it, in truth. Many good artists, but good artists are being rediscovered every day. And that's, shame on us, because we tend to stick with the big figure. Shame on us museums. We tend to like the big names. But there's more and more, as more and more comes out about artists of different persuasions, different races, different diversity. More and more comes about, particularly female artists who are largely overlooked. I'll never forget Dorothea Rockburn when someone asked her in an interview, was it difficult for women artists when you were coming up? She said, yes. It's not this. She said, was it difficult not being recognized? She said, it wasn't even a question of not being recognized. It was a question of being totally invisible, like you didn't exist at that point, just totally overlooked in that way. You didn't count, no matter how hard you worked and no matter how good you thought what you were doing was important. So, there are discoveries every day you read about. Thank goodness we've all, the canon of, the canon is, and all institutions are doing it and looking at what they're doing and trying to do a better job of it, both in who they, who's making the decisions and what voices you're hearing. We're all working hard, so there's a lot of lost ground, though. It's a lot to make up for. That's not to say we don't, love our Picasso. I mean, come on. I'm sure he was reprehensible in most things, but some pretty great paintings. This has been a treat, you all. It's been a great crowd every time. I'm so glad to do this. I love to do this, so they only let me do it about, every year when we have a big show. I just think there's so much, to know about a show like this. It's wonderful for me to be able to look at it a little more in depth, too. All right. Thank you all. You're great.